Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you would like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. On today's episode, Leo Finelli joins us to discuss his podcast about Generation Z, comparing himself to others, and his creative process. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Leo, thanks so much for joining me here on Autism Stories.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And I'd love to start out our conversation by learning, where does your story in the autistic community begin?
First of all, I'd like to challenge the notion of a single autistic community because we are so plural and so much of us is not really related to autism that I would challenge putting it that way. But if you're wanting to know where my specific individual journey with autism started, and it started in early education and kindergarten. So during my third year of preschool, which was the 2006-2007 school year, just a few months into the school year, I was pulled out of preschool and I was homeschooled for the rest of the 06-07 academic year. And I continued to be homeschooled for the first couple months of the 07-08 academic year. But then I went to public school, sort of. I came in, I went to kindergarten, but I wasn't there in the first part of the day. I would arrive kind of midway through the day. And the fact that I was homeschooled and the fact that once I did go to school again, it was not the way the other kids were going to school was a big hint to little 6-year-old me that there was just something about me that was different. I did not know what it was. I just knew that there must be something about me that makes me different from everybody else. And I especially started to believe this after I observed that I was already reading chapter books way above kindergarten level. Other kids could barely get through. It wasn't Dick and Jane, but it was stuff kind of like that, similar level. And they were. So I'm coming in about midway through the day, and this is like 2007, 2008. And the other kids have like these little easy reader books that they're struggling to read. Meanwhile, I'm whizzing through Beverly Cleary. And so that is a big hint that I'm different somehow. And when I learned I was autistic was in, I think 2010 was when I was first told, after we had moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, which we did specifically so I could have more opportunities, though I didn't fully register that that was the main reason why when we moved, because I was 8. I don't remember where I was. I think it was at the kitchen table in the house where we still live. But one thing I do remember about being told by my parents that I was autistic was, I don't know if I really didn't believe them, but I was stunned and confused. I had heard about autism, But all I'd ever heard about autism is that it's something so hard that when a parent hears that their child has autism, it's like hearing that their child has been killed in a car crash. So all I'd ever heard about autism was that it was this negative, tragic thing. And that just goes to show you what the conversation was like at that time, what the stigma was like at that time. And I don't know if I was in disbelief when I first learned, but I was definitely astonished. I was like, wait, all that I've heard about, that's me?
Now, I often think about Generation Z, those that are teens that are in their mid 20s, as I have three nieces in that generation. So, thinking about Gen Z, you host a podcast, Generation Change, that highlights Gen Z social justice voices, change makers, and creators. What do you think are important things for people to know about Generation Z?
Well, contrary to popular belief, we do in fact vote, and we're not all socialists who hate America. We have more ways to communicate than anyone ever, and yet still, our most favorite way to communicate is in person, face to face. We are more kind, more accepting, less squeamish about tough topics for discussion. We're more willing to talk about these tough things. I didn't really have any friends before I started my podcast. Now, all my friends are mostly people who have been on my podcast, but they all live far away from me, so I don't really see them in person. I've only ever met two of my podcast guests in person as of this recording.
That's one of the great things that I've found from hosting a podcast is the connections that you build with others that otherwise you probably never would have had that opportunity. On one episode, you had a guest on your podcast that said, one way to really help build bridges is to become better listeners. So I'm wondering, by listening to your guests, what have you been some things you learned from them that you might not have otherwise realized?
So I've learned how to do social skills. I've learned that people are very complex, and that's kind of what I wanted to start this podcast to show. One of my reasons for doing it. So I've learned social skills. I've learned about the complexity of these people I meet with. I've learned what they're like, how they see the world, how they're different from the way I am, and that they're very kind and open and accepting, just like I said.
I started my podcast in 2018, Autism Stories, and I've seen so many podcasts come and go since then. So I'm always so interested about the podcast experience from an executive functioning perspective, how people continuously and consistently create new episodes. So you've hosted Generation Change, I believe, since 2020. What's been your process in creating episodes on a consistent basis?
So I do it once a month. Sometimes I build up backlogs of episodes several months in advance. So I invite my guests, usually over a direct message on Instagram, and I schedule a date with them. Then we record. One time I accidentally forgot to hit record and I had to do it all over again with the same person several days later. But after it's all recorded, I use this audio editing software called Audiate to edit it down. And then I record an opening and closing segment and tag it along with the music to my episode. And then I release an episode on the first of every month. And I used to have more help from my parents with doing this, but now I mostly do it by myself. And I release a new episode of my podcast on the first of every month.
That's my biggest fear with podcasts is forgetting to hit the record button. I am always so worried I'm going to forget to do that at the beginning of each episode.
So that was a mistake. That wasn't a mistake, actually, that I even made in the early days of my podcast. That was a mistake that I only made in one of the past years' episode. But the friend I was interviewing, she was like, no worries. And we scheduled another date and recorded it all again.
It's wonderful that your friend was understanding. So, beyond being a podcast host, you're the author of the book Seven Slices of Life, which is a children's chapter book about the everyday adventures of a 9 year old. I'm wondering how your personal experience inspires the main character of your book.
So I appreciate the everyday moments. And I think that's because I haven't always been good in social situations. And so I love just getting to do them. I remember, I think this is kind of applicable here, but the first time I ever heard the song Part of Your World from The Little Mermaid, it made me cry because that's how I felt. Like, I wanted to be where the people are. I wanted to be just as adept and able at being a part of all these social situations as everybody else was. So, like, something as simple as like going to a restaurant or even just the post office, that was kind of magical for me because I'm like, yes, I get to be an everyday normal kid. I get to have the adventures that a normal everyday person gets to have. And so I think that gave me an appreciation of moments like these that others may not have. And though autism is never mentioned in Seven Slices of Life, but for all the people listening to this podcast right now, I'm going to tell you it's canon. The main character is autistic. And I also think when I was little, I would sometimes imagine my own experiences, like going to a friend's birthday party or going to the South Carolina State Fair, because I spent the first 9 years of my life in South Carolina. And I would imagine going to these kinds of things in my head as books with what was happening on an imaginary page in my head. I imagined where the chapter breaks would be, what the chapters would be called. And I think another reason why I did this and why I wanted to write a book like this was because the books I was reading, and like I said, that I was reading at an age way below when most people read these books, is Beverly Cleary and Judy Blume. And those are two authors who write a lot about everyday life happenings and explore personalities, explore characters and their relationships through everyday life happenings. And I was relating to that and imagining that being a book about what I was doing when I was little. And so you could kind of say that when I wrote this book, it ended up being this very episodic, almost short story collection, but it reflects the randomness and unpredictability and plurality of real life, and that was the goal.
So maybe more than anything these days, I think of myself as a creator. So I'm really fascinated about the creative process from others. And I read that you're passionate about getting creative. So I'd love to know if there are any things, strategies, or processes that help your creativity to flow.
in this notebook right here, I have notes on my next book, which I am writing right now. It's not a direct sequel to Seven Slices of Life, and it's targeted an older audience than Seven Slices of Life. Like my first one was more for elementary schoolers. This next one is going to be for high schoolers. So I can write lots of genres, lots of different age groups, many different kinds of stories. And so just looking back at this notebook, I have I'm looking at a page right now where I have written short little summaries of who my characters are. Like, my main character is described here as a plain high schooler looking for her purpose in life. She appreciates her friends and wants friends who appreciate her back and will help her find her purpose. And then below that, for the next character, it is her friend who has ADHD, a kind hearted political science nerd, really likes the main character and is friendly to her. I have this page where I figure out who my characters are. Then I write an outline of bullet points of like everything that's going to happen in the story. And then, like, in parentheses next to it, things I added after I made the original bullet list to enrich each bullet point and get the most out of that moment. And sometimes after doing these character bio and this outline once, I do them all over again and see what I've discovered newly from doing them the first time, and they become more comprehensive then. So yeah, that's how I flesh out my ideas on paper and get them to the point where I can finally write them down as a book. But as for how I actually come up with these ideas, David Foster, who's this multi Grammy winning music producer, who I actually met once, he says that you know an idea is good and that you need to follow through with it when it comes through you and not from you. And I've experienced that, and I can tell the difference between an idea coming through me and an idea coming from me. And I agree with him that the best ideas, the ones you know you love and can write about and can finish to the end, are the ones that come through you. And I've had a lot of unfinished projects, so that has helped me learn. In fact, if you read the little author's note that I put at the beginning of Seven Slices of Life, I actually wrote that book because I had this backlog of unfinished scripts that I had never really gotten to a point that I was happy with or felt were finished. And I wasn't really feeling them anymore, but I also wanted to finish what I started. So I put together. Originally, this was going to be like a true short story collection with turning each of these like scripts that I had never gotten produced or finished into a short story. Then, when I realized that the characters in each story had some similarities and there were some similar themes across the stories, I was like, this could be a whole book about a single kid and his mom and his older brother and his best friend, just everyday adventures they have together. And started writing this on January 24th, 2024, which was, I believe, a Wednesday. And I remember that night I was just having so much fun coming up with the entire outline for what this book was going to be in my notebook. And then the very next morning, January 25th, sit down and I write it. And that journey eventually led me to the publication of Seven Slices of Life on May 1st, 2024.
And then lastly, Leo, how can our listeners learn more about you, the Generation Change podcast, and Seven Slices of Life?
Well, you can order the book Seven Slices of Life on Amazon, and by the time this episode comes out, my next book will probably be up there pretty shortly. You can listen to my podcast, Generation Change, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you just want to reach out to me and say hi, you can email me at finelli.leo@gmail.com. I would love to hear from anyone and everyone who hears this interview and just wants to write to me and say hi. I would love that.
Well, Leo, I really appreciate the time getting to know you. Thanks so much for joining me here on Autism Stories, and I can't wait to see when your next book comes out.
Wait, can I say a few things that are not direct responses to your questions, but I think it's important that the listeners know?
Sure, go ahead.
So, I graduated from college in December 2022. And since then, it has been very, very, very hard for me to have a job and find a job and keep one. I went into a training program at a place called Zab's Place, which is a thrift store designed to give job experience to special needs teens and adults. And I heavily struggled there. And my time there revealed what I would need to have to do better if I was going to be in a real job situation. Fortunately, leaving Zabs and leaving the training program with these issues still largely unresolved gave me the incentive to learn from my mistakes. Sometimes I am not good at learning or do not seem willing to learn, but I believe that I can learn and do and perform as a job anything if I'm motivated enough. And I feel like getting that motivation can be the challenge. So, other than that training program at Zabs and making money and stuff off my book, I have not really had any job or consistent daily or weekly actual work activities since graduating from college. This has given me so much open space, so much bandwidth, so much time to be bored, and that has contributed negatively to my mental health. Other things I struggle with include imposter syndrome. Like, all my friends, of course, are people who have been on this podcast, and other people who may not have been on this podcast, but who I did reach out to and become friends with long distance. One thing that really makes me emotional is when I see my friends achieve these amazing things while I continue to wallow, stuck in my bedroom, hopeless, feeling like my situation is never going to change, like I'm behind everyone else, like I'm less than, like I'm less accomplished, and it makes me feel terrible. So, like, when I see stuff like one of my friends doing a voice in the English dub of a Netflix TV show, or another one of my friends getting to be the conductor for Spider Man Across the Spider Verse live in concert. And yes, these really are things that two of my friends are doing. When I hear the news that they're doing stuff that amazing, I'm happy for them, but it also makes me feel like, you know, what about me? What about, compared to that, my accomplishments are nothing. All my friends are so much better and so much more accomplished than I am. I'm just stuck in my bedroom and they're doing this. And that can be really hard sometimes. And this isn't just something that's happening now. This goes all the way back to when I was a little kid watching Sesame Street on TV and hearing the voice of a little girl who wasn't physically on the screen singing a song over some footage of kids on a playground. And even then, I was like obsessed with finding out who's that little girl and what is it that made her able to have this opportunity to sing a Sesame Street song while I'm here. In the age of information, I've realized visibility is currency. It's a currency that maybe at least maintains the illusion of some people's accomplishments being more valuable than others. Maybe that's a big societal thing that a lot of people are feeling. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but comparing myself to others has always been a fatal flaw and a source of mental health struggles and insecurity. I often feel like I am 24/7, 365 permeated by this sense that I am less than or I am faulty, and that I have to vigorously earn my right to be on the same tier as everybody else.
Well, I know you're not less than. I know you're not I know you're not faulty. And one thing I've learned as an older person, Leo, is playing the comparison game. You never win at that one. We never win with the comparison game. But I think the way we do win is by a lot of times by using our creativity. And I think as you continue to use your creativity to write more books, to have more podcast episodes, more and more opportunities are just going to come your way. And I thank you for joining us today and look forward to seeing those opportunities come your way.
Okay, thank you so much for having me on this podcast. I love having the opportunity to share a little bit about myself and my journey.
Thanks so much to Leo for the conversation. To learn more about Leo, please check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. Did you know Autism Personal Coach provides neurodiversity affirming support by autistics for autistics? We empower autistic adults and teens to lead self-directed, purpose-driven lives through our customized life coaching and community groups. Our distinct approach prioritizes each client's unique goals and preferences, fostering a sense of agency and promoting self-advocacy. Coaches work collaboratively with clients to develop personalized strategies and tools that can help with executive functioning, emotional regulation, relationship building, stress management, and much more. We also support parents and partners of autistic people by providing insights and guidance to bridge communication gaps and nurture mutual understanding. With our accessible remote services, individuals from any location can receive the assistance and mentoring they need. Join us today to experience judgment-free coaching rooted in empathy, expertise, and respect for autistic identity. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.